We do this series together once a year, and we're delighted to do it. We're the global folks, KDL, local folks. We try to do this global view of the world together, and it's been a lot of fun to do. And this series has been particularly incredible and fascinating, I think. Our council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world, do that with the help of many people and organizations. And if you want to know more about what we do, you can go to worldmichigan.org and find out more about us. But tonight, I want to give Henny and her team a chance to talk about KDL, too, because it's partly their series. So Henny, why don't you come up and do that?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, thanks to all of you for being here tonight. This is the third and final part of the series we've been doing with World Affairs Council. We do one every year, and I just have to say it's been so impactful and educational, this entire series. So yes, I just want to thank them once again for taking this on and doing it so thoughtfully and carefully. I do want to do a land acknowledgement, and a land acknowledgement is not something we do tritely. It is something we say. It is, I realize, only words, but it's a place to start as we think about the land we're on, the people we share this land with, as we think about our entire community. And the library is all about thinking about our community and welcoming everybody into our spaces. So with that, I'd like to say Kent District Library acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, or Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi tribes. While the Treaty of Chicago in 1821 sold most land south of the Grand Rapids River, and the Treaty of Washington in 1836 sold most land north of the river, we acknowledge the vibrancy and the continued presence of Native peoples living in our community. Kent District Library is committed to accurately representing our community and hopes that we may reflect on the ways history shapes the current issues we face together. And with that, I'd like to welcome Michael up to the stage again. We have a full roster of events here at KDL, lots of programs for all ages, and you can check those out at kdl.org/events. Thank you.
Thanks, Henny. Yeah, let's thank the KDL folks for hosting. The Granville Branch folks, thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing to set up. We are very pleased to have Guntram and Patricia LeBon with us. Came all the way from Vermont to be with us today. Guntram is a professor of geography at Middlebury College in Vermont. He has written several books about Indigenous people and nationalism, and his current research is on the Indigenous borderlands and border rights. It's about the challenges of Native nations along the U.S.-Canada border. Patricia is an artist and poet from Middlebury, with many of her poems published and numerous gallery shows and illustrations of book covers. She is of Belgian Native American descent, and she is an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of the Chippewa Indians. After Guntram and Patricia present this evening, there'll be ample time for conversation and questions. And as always, our house rules, please ask your question respectfully and succinctly so we can get as many questions in as possible. The presentation tonight is titled Giyade and the Yaman Oma. We are still here, Native Americans to the U.S.-Canada border. Let us welcome Guntram and Patricia to West Michigan.
Buzu, Anin, Zabingokwe, Nishnikas, Mikanuk, Doden, Bawating, Anishinabek, and Do de Bendagwas, Middlebury, Vermont, and Donjiba. My native name is Zabingokwe. It means river woman. My European name is Patricia LeBon Herb. I'm of the Turtle Clan, and I'm an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. Currently, I live in Middlebury, Vermont. My father was a Belgian immigrant, and he married my part Odawa Ojibwa mother, and my grandfather is from Mackinac. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm a little shy because I don't speak in front of audience regularly, but just bear with me. And miigwech for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. So after Patricia introduced herself, let me just move on and explain what we're going to do here tonight. So I actually had a land acknowledgement prepared too, but we can go through this since we had the land acknowledgement already done here. These are important things, as Hedy said, to acknowledge what land we're on actually here and where it came from. And the first step is to acknowledge, and then we can work towards truth and reconciliation and try to figure out how to go and do the next steps. I did the same thing in Middlebury. We had started a land acknowledgement. So I had one prepared, but I'm glad this is the one that is locally developed because it always goes in consultation with the groups whose land actually you reside on. So we're gonna go have 5 little short sections of our talk tonight. We're gonna start out with what is called land grab, European discovery and claims to territory. So how did actually Europeans end up taking this land? Then we move to part 2, forced assimilation. So once the land was taken, what happened to the natives that lived here? How they were tried to be disappeared. And then we talk about our field work, Patty and I, we did along the border. And then we talk about what we found in that field work, the crossing rights, how indigenous people deal with the border or are they affected by the border. And then finally, we talk about, on a positive note, about native survivance, because native people are not disappeared, they're not vanished, they're here, they're with us. There's many people, in the audience there's several, and they're alive, and there is actually a renaissance of native people going on. The difficult things you listened to in the last couple presentations are important to work through, but we also have to realize that there is something actually that's positive, that's moving forward. It's not all sad, it's also positive. So that's what we're gonna do. And each of these 5 segments, Patty will introduce with her artwork and a poem. So we start with the first one. So a land grab European discovery. So we start with poem Native to This World.
Native to this world. The pregnant Ojibwa woman sings songs while finger weaving yarns to make a sash. Her young daughter still asleep. I am that daughter. The German boy, part of a brutal war he knew nothing about, he could not clear the events from his mind. I am that boy. The Korean child cut rice alongside 3 generations, now a grandmother. Those were to be the best days of her life. I am that grandmother. The aristocrat lawyer in south of France studied languages, played the harp, composed and sang songs to small audiences. I am that gentleman. The Persian two-spirited calligrapher hid his true nature from her family, not able to transcribe their own story. I am they. The African immigrant with 7 coins in his pocket worked on a boat, leaving wife and child never to return. I am that immigrant. The young settler hoed a parcel of land, worked his hands to the bone, preparing a new life for a future family. I am that settler. The Jewish girl separated from her family in Berlin to save a life, to have a safe life in the new world. She would never see her parents again. I am that orphan. The young elder traveled across the northern border of Turtle Island with her partner to reunite with her mother's people, and they were welcomed. I am that elder. I am native to this world.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you. So yeah, we're all native to some place, and now we're going to talk about what actually happened when Europeans came here and how they took the land and how they justified that land. So this is often called the doctrine of discovery. So when you see here on the images, Christopher Columbus landing, 1492, and he claimed this land from what he called the heathens, from the non-Christian people. And this was actually based on the doctrine of discovery, which is a series of papal edicts that justify taking non-Christian lands. So there was 3 of them that usually are referred to. These are just pronouncements by the popes that said, if you come to a land where there is non-Christians, you can take the land. And actually, you can also enslave them. And Christopher Columbus was one of the first ones to do this. He enslaved the Taino people in the Caribbean. So this is also part of the story of how Europeans came and claimed and justified this. Now, why am I telling an old story about 1492, over 500 years ago? Well, that doctrine of discovery has not been fully rescinded. Even though recently the Pope has said, yes, we rescind this, it is still part of our legal system in the United States. Thomas Jefferson argued it gave the US government the right to take over land from the Europeans after they took it from the British. In 1792, the US Supreme Court Justice John Marshall also argued the same thing and said it gave the US the right to hold onto this land in 1823. Another doctrine or legal justification is John Locke's idea of property, of private property, and the idea of vacuum domicilium, which basically is just a fancy way of saying empty land. You always put it in Latin, then it sounds a lot more fancy and a lot more legalistic. So John Locke argued that land was not owned by anyone unless you improved it, and then it became property. And Europeans, that's how they did if you look here at the allotment, you see those hedgerows, those were ways of marking territory. And they basically were looking at the native land here and said, there's no markings like this. The Indians have not. And I'm using Indians because it's also used oftentimes by native people here. There's a debate about it, but Paddy's tribe uses Indian in their definition or in their name. So it's with respect that I'm saying it. So anyway, they were looking at the land and said, it doesn't look like this here, so they haven't done anything, it's our land. But in fact, the land was not used. Native people had made the land look kind of like park-like here because they had done controlled burns to draw game into closer to their villages to make it easier for them. So they had actually modified the land. So that's one of the evidence that this was not empty land. We also have from archaeological digs, there's and pictographs that we can find. This one is from Agua Rock in Lake Superior. Those that is being established now too by scholars, those were actually markings of this is our territory here. So this reflected an idea about this. Native people had a vast trading network from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to the west. And we know this from all the objects that we find in different places. So this was a land that was used, intensively used by different peoples. And they even made alliances and treaties and agreements with each other about territories, and later with Europeans. This is the Wampum Belt, was when they made an agreement with Europeans, but they used it before among themselves as well. And then finally, we have evidence from oral history, and this quote captures it maybe the best. The border lies where the land and the stories on the other side belong to someone else. So oral history also told about that this was land. One more legal document is, or legal argument is American Progress and Manifest Destiny, that American settlers were destined to reach the West Coast and take over the entire continent. And you see on this very famous painting, you can see from John Gast here, American Progress from 1872. There is Columbia, the woman in the center, who personifies the United States, and she holds a telegraph line and a school book, and she moves Enlightenment towards the West Coast, and you see the Indians in the corner kind of being in the dark, and they're just vanishing. So this idea was also propagated to justify to the school children and to everyone else that this was the land of the new settlers who took it over. So we move now to, now the land was taken over, forced assimilation, disappearing the Indians. What happened then once the land was taken? And we'll start off again with a poem by Patricia, Grandfather, Michigan, 1940. And that's her painting, Ojibwe Woman.
Okay. Thank you. Grandfather, Michigan, 1940. When he got the news that his brother walked on, he took his bundle and drum with the fox fur drumstick he received from Takwajawan. Out from under his bed, he quietly beat his drum made of elk hide in his bedroom where he wept. He sang a song like no song sung before. After dark, he brought outside his bundle. He took out the pipe that was his grandfather's, folded inside the soft leather pouch from Uncle, and assembled the two parts. He pressed inside the bowl tobacco harvested by his mother. He lit the sema and blew out his solemn prayer to Creator, and remained there on his lawn chair long into a blue moonless night, with the centipedes, crickets, fireflies, where it was safe to come out. And I just want to mention that prior to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, sacred ceremonies were illegal to practice.
And then we'll go for the next one. Missing.
Oh, okay.
So we have one more.
Okay,
It's a haiku.
this is a huge topic that we're just skirting on. And I wrote a haiku. And this is a painting I did representing missing and murdered Indigenous women. Missing, perched on a tree high, her body no longer hers, flowing down the creek.
And you heard about this story in the previous lectures that were given here. And yes, that's a real way to disappear the native people, when you could kill them and they disappear completely and nothing is being done about it. You also heard about the eradication of the native language and culture in the boarding schools as well. So these are stories we just want to kind of bring back into your awareness. But what Patty had said, not many people know that this country that was founded on religious freedom, the stories you hear in school about the pilgrims coming here, the people that were here were not allowed to practice their religion. In 1883, it became banned to do native dances and do religious ceremonies. And not until 1978. That's pretty recent.
It was a good day.
Yeah. Could Native Americans practice their religion or their sacred ceremonies? These things are important to remember. Similarly, there was a dispossession and fragmentation of Native communities. The Dawes, or the Allotment Act that it's called, from 1887. So natives had made treaties, and the litany of broken treaties, where they were pushed then on reservations and reservation lands, but that wasn't enough. This was communally held land. The idea was then, well, that's not American. We need to give everybody their own personal property. So they divided reservation lands up in lots, about 80 acres or 160, and they gave it to each native head of household, and the rest was sold to other people, to settlers. So what happened was that you had what's called a checkerboarding of reservations. Here is the Grand Traverse Band Reservation in Leelanau County in Michigan here. And this is what you see there in color, that's the reservation land. And of the 87,000 original reservation land holdings, we only have 700 acres left by 1900. So, and this is the remaining land in the reservation. The yellow one was sold to settlers from the beginning, and then settlers were actually homesteading it. They would just go there and set up shop, and then at one point asked to keep it. So they were squatting it, and they got it. And then the state of Michigan also took some more land. So this is devastating to the community that even you can't even live together. You're actually suddenly interspersed with all settler people as well. So your community gets destroyed territorially as well. The disintegration of Indian families in the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. They tried to get Native people to move to urban areas, come to urban areas, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, for jobs, Denver. And of course, that took many of the younger people away again from the community and brought them there. The only thing is it somewhat backfired, because in Minneapolis, a lot of Native people met other Native groups and realized they shared this common discrimination, and AIM was founded kind of out of that experience. And then there is, I don't know if this was talked about with the boarding school, the 60s scoops, as it's called. So in the 1960s, social services would go into Indian families and pull children out, saying, you live substandard here, there's like an outhouse, you don't have running water, you have all these problems, overcrowding, and there's abuse. And they would take the children and place them with non-Native parents. And oftentimes, as you can see from the map, they would actually move them either across the border into Canada from the US or vice versa, or even abroad to Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and other places as well. So this 60 scoops, again, you're taking away the next generation. That is really destructive. And then finally, I'm a geographer, so I always look at maps. Mapping, the way we show Native people in this country, in the United States, also or in North America, is you silence Native people. So this is a map from 1794, shows the French, the British, and the Spanish holding most of the land here. Well, 3/4 of that continent actually was under full Native control when that map was being made. And we just watched Ken Burns' wonderful documentary, American Buffalo, but this is a map that was included there. I immediately had to take a picture of it. And here you can see, it looks like, oh, it's already all taken. There's no Native people left. You think about Thomas Jefferson proposed states. You divide up the land into states. There's no Native people left. But wait, National Geographic made a map of Indian country. Yeah, shows, kind of celebrates that. But strangely enough, there's no natives across the border in Canada. It stops right at the border. So the only way you show Native people, either in Canada or here, is when they're inside the state. They're not recognized as actually spreading across all of Turtle Island. So we get to our borderland project, the work that Patty and I did, and we start off with the poem Williston, North Dakota.
Okay, thank you. Leaving Williston, North Dakota. Crucifixes with plastic white flowers, an assortment of feathers with strips of bright colored cloth woven around a cross, commemorating another Native American Indian on this stretch of road. 2 crosses means they were a pair, telephone poles and wires, a skeletal dog with a collar, shards of black rubber from large semi-trucks left behind, insects and birds, bison on yonder, a bear, a raven, yield to the machine, shimmering sweetgrass, wingashk, on open fields, a long stretch of road in between. Unthreaded hay, strands of wheat in the hot, hazy breeze of summer. A woman in moccasins pulls quills from a dead porcupine off the side of the road for making quill boxes and baskets later. She might lay down tobacco and give thanks to this elder, Nabayawag, in honor of his life and purpose. She'll leave the animal behind. It's too heavy.
to carry home.
So we talk about this project now that we did, and this project along the border that Patty gave you a glimpse of what we saw along the road. This started in Sault Ste. Marie in October 2010 and was inspired by an Mkiwe Widom, Richard Lewis, who is actually with us tonight in the audience. We're very honored to have him and his wife, Stephanie Krebs, who is also a Sault Ste. Marie tribal member with us tonight. So Richard invited Patty and me to attend an Eagle Staff gathering. It's a gathering where community members come together and will share stories and do teachings, build community. And the Eagle Staff gathering didn't get underway for quite a while because it was delayed. There were people missing. And those were the people who came from Canada. We were waiting on them. And they finally came and they said, yeah, they were hassled at the border. Well, they carry eagle parts, right? Do you see the big eagle head there? It's all eagle feathers. And you're not actually allowed to own eagles parts unless you're native. You have to have a permit for that because it's a sacred bird. And it was a sacred bird to native people a lot longer, but the government restricts it. And so at the border, they were asked, what nationality are you? And they said, North American. The border guard did not like that and then asked them for documentation and it delayed it and everything else. And in the teaching, the elders were telling us, well, you know, we have the right to cross the border. There's the Jay Treaty and all that. And I'd never heard of anything like that. And I thought, this is interesting. And yeah, indeed, Native Anishinaabe people, they're on both sides of the border. Border cuts across. They have the right to cross, but nobody seemed to know about it. I did some research. The only book I could find that looked at all the Native nations across the United States on all borders was 140 pages. Very little. It was just a little picture book, kind of. I thought, somebody has to do something like this. And I looked around and I couldn't find anything. Well, Native nations are deeply impacted by this border. The border cuts them off from their homeland, maybe, from relatives, from places where they gather sacred medicine, from burial grounds, from celebrations, powwows that they have to cross. So there is their land that they could move freely before is suddenly dissected. And so that impact, I thought we needed to know more about that. So I'm a scholar, so I figured, but what can I, as a non-native person, say about this? Well, the only thing I can do is I can go and meet native people that live on the border and listen and learn. And my work will have to be guided by Minadindamowin, respect in the Anishinaabe language. I was lucky to have a native research partner, Patricia, who could help me with the cultural protocol of how do you approach people to talk about it? Do you offer tobacco? And this was clearly not the regular scholarship. This is not something you get tenure with, usually. So this was post-tenure. This is scholarship because it's engaged. That means you can't be, there is no such thing as an objective researcher who says, you know, I look at this. Heisenberg already told us that any experiment that there's a human in there is already changing it. But engaged scholarship means you try to understand and maybe advocate and speak on behalf of the people that you engage with. And this research was digital by necessity. So there's a website that comes out of that. Because publishing a book and then some native people come to me afterwards and say, what you wrote there is wrong. I can't take that back, it's out there. If it's on the website, I can take it down or I can put a disclaimer on there. So there was no way I was gonna write that research into a book. Other parts I can't. And so Patty and I decided, what do we do? Well, let's look at that border. And when we look closer, woof, that's a long border, 5,225 miles. And so we got an old camper van and we said, let's go for it. I have a sabbatical. And we traveled in the first summer field work. We drove 10,000 miles. We went from New Brunswick, Maine, zigzagging the border all the way to British Columbia, Washington State. talked to 14 indigenous communities, and did 18 border crossings. And then the following summer, we did another 14,500 miles, spoke to 60 native communities, 24 border crossings, and went all the way up to Alaska. And boy, when you're up there in Alaska, you realize you're far away. Now we have to drive all the way back. But it was an amazing journey. We met so many people. We learned so much about the border and about Native people and the resilience they have. And since we have gone back since then a few times, I didn't have a sabbatical, so I couldn't go more, but 28,500 miles about total that we drove along the border so far. And now we'll tell you some of the things we found. It should be in there.
It's not.
Uh-oh. So there's a major poem that we were supposed to read that is not in there, so that is a problem.
But go ahead with your talk and I'll read it off my phone.
Okay, she'll find the poem in a second. So in the meantime, this is what you're going to hear later. I will talk about some of the things we found. So the first thing is, the border is not a line. We think of the border as a line. It's not a line. It's a zone of enforcement. For actually 100 miles of a border enforcement zone. Within that 100 miles, you can be stopped by by the border patrol, and they can ask you for your documentation. Where are you a citizen? You have a right to be here. So within that time. And this has an impact on Native communities. Look at that border zone up there in like in Montana and Washington State. You see all these reservations. They're right in that border zone. And so one of the members of the Flathead Indian Nation told us CBP, so Customs and Border Patrol, and ICE, Immigration and Control enforcement agencies are targeting brown people, and that includes us. So continuously being under the threat of being searched is a tremendous problem. The second thing we found is that many border crossings have limited opening hours. You would think that you could always leave, right? Or you could always come in. No, there is border crossings that are open. Well, this one that I'm showing you here from the Blackfeet Reservation is open from 7 to 7 in the mornings, even though over 260,000 people cross it every year. And that means, let me just finish this one. So that means that you go to a sacred circle across the border, and the sacred circle ends, when it's done, these people are suddenly stuck on the other side. They have to take a detour of a couple hundred miles if they want to come home still that night, or they have to wait. So those are serious kind of impacts on Native communities who have relatives and other people of the same nation on the other side, and they cannot come whenever they want. They have kind of opening hours. And now we're going to go and have Peggy read her.
Found the poem. Okay. Everything the power of the world does is in a circle. Black elk. The borderland. As we zigzag the US and Canada border from Maine to Seattle and into Alaska, we travel through native lands, families and friends separated, long lines of cars and trucks on lands and bridges, close communities divided. Passports to be shown, sunglasses off. Those with a DUI cannot cross over even as passengers, or ever again, I heard it said. Sometimes it's a long trek, other times not. Reservations and reserves, two separate lands on one border or another. Veteran elders come to participate at Eagle Staff gatherings, some well into their 90s. Regalia and bundles inside the car, the border patrol, depending who you get, know better now not to go through them. Officers with good training have learned to respect the ways and traditions different from theirs. Indigenous men, women, and children come to participate in a powwow, a celebration, a sacred circle on the other side. First Nations go south, Native Americans go north, First Alaskans go east, North First Nations go west. To participate and celebrate, to give thanks for each other, the earth, the land and waters, animals and trees, stories from another time. Everything done in a circle, intricately sewn regalia, headdresses, jingle dresses made with feathers, beads, and the hide of buffalo, caribou, deer, and seal. Songs and traditions from long ago to say we are one in a circle with no borders.
So one thing to remember is that native crossings are an assertion actually of a separate nationhood, and that sovereignty predates US and Canada political regimes. One of the chiefs we met, Dean Sayers, on Bechuana First Nation, said to us, United States and Canadian authority, because I asked him, what do you do against that authority when you cross the border? He says, what authority? They're visiting governments. We've been here a long time. They have only been here a very short time, and we're going to be here again. So Native people have the right to cross through treaties. They're not transgressing. And one of the central treaties is the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America, 1794, known as the Jay Treaty. And I'm not going to read this whole thing here, but this treaty has several significance. One is it acknowledged and codified Indian rights to cross freely. And it implicitly recognized Indian sovereignty, meaning the right over their own destiny. When the treaty was signed, more than 3/4 of the continent remained under Indian rule, under Indian sovereignty already. So they were sovereign, and this treaty was signed, they have the right to cross. So they're not transgressing, the border crossed them. But there's complications when Native people go to the border, because who is, quote unquote, Indian? Well, the US government reserves the right to define who is Indian, who is Native, not tribes. And blood quantum is one of those. I call it the last tool for getting rid of Indians. Because the blood quantum is identified by tribe. So if someone who is Cherokee marries someone who is Anishinaabe, their children, they're both full-blooded, their children are only 50% blood quantum of either Anishinaabe or Cherokee, their choice. So then think about those children marrying somebody who is maybe full-blooded Native, but from another one. It dilutes it over time. So that was one of the big fears. I met one of the medicine men along our journey who said he was full-blood, his wife was full-blooded, my children are suddenly 50%. He was worried, what's going to come next when they marry somebody who is still Native but from a different tribe. So this blood quantum is a problem, and tribes are slowly changing their own membership rules to descent rather than blood quantum, because it's problematic. Canada does not recognize the Jay Treaty because they say it was signed by a different sovereign, the Crown. Well, then I'm asking, why do you still have the Queen on your money? And why is the Queen, now King Charles, actually the symbolic head of state of Canada? So the symbolic head, the representative head of state of Canada is still the Crown. But they won't recognize that treaty. They reserve the right to interpret the treaty the way they want to. And there's different crossing rights. So for example, if you have a DUI or a DWI, the Canadian government can refuse you to enter even your entire life, and they don't have to justify that because it's a felony in Canada. So really the border is Indians, Native people are silenced on the border. The tangible scene of the border is taken for granted and naturalized. This is how most people think of North America, Canada and the United States. And Native people, they're either inside Canada or inside the United States. And this became really, really clear when we went to the International Peace Garden in North Dakota. So this is in border of North Dakota, Manitoba. It's about 20 miles northwest of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. There was not a single mention of anything Native American or First Nation in that border park. See the park there, it runs actually, so it goes, that's the border, that long line there. On either side is Canada. They have these beautiful little posts here with languages from around the world on all different sides. Not a single one of those languages is a native language. They're all from all over the world. They have a chapel, the Peace Chapel. They have inspiring quotes from the world. They even have Sartre in there. I mean, he was an atheist, for crying out loud. Nothing, no native person is quoted in there, no black elk, no nothing. So really, the border people's heads, the natives don't seem to have a place on the border. But we are still here. I'm saying that on behalf of my native wife and the native people here. I'm not native, but we're going to start off that
It's
with.
okay, we still like you.
We'll start off with the poem, How Much Indian Are You?
Okay. I really had fun writing this poem. How much Indian are you? A stone's throw across the river, 20 feathers off the hawk, 1 fry bread worth, 20 flute songs, a bundle of tobacco, a pint of blood pumped from my mother's heart, according to the chart. The doctor, missionary, author, anthropologist will tell us our ratio, if we are authentic or not. Who's telling our story? A distant relative sold land traded for frog skins with a small forest of trees to close the deal. An auntie ran off with a French fur trapper. They moved to town, bringing us forward, then down. Cohabitation, regulation, assimilation, eradication. Papers needed to cross a line. However you measure, I'm keeping my treasure.
So yeah, there's a lot of survivance, meaning resilience and a renaissance of native activities across the border. Food sovereignty, for example. Buffalo ranges now are being discussed, so you have that buffalo can range across the border. The Salish people in British Columbia and Washington State allowed to harvest across the border, and so and food is so central to all of us. Food it sustains us, it makes us, but it's also community, it's also our heritage. And so for Native people, going back to the native food, and that's why that painting that we showed of Patty was the ricing, going back to wild rice, the traditional way, harvesting the fish the traditional way, and eating native foods, going back to that is so central to better nutrition and community health. Native cultures across the border, powwows. We go to the Sault Ste. Marie powwow every year, and there's always people from Canada. It's across the border, and it wouldn't be half as much fun without all the people coming from the different places. So cultural, native culture crosses borders. Native sovereignty gets asserted across the border. There's every year these tribal journeys. We were lucky to attend one in Vancouver Island. So these are native people who paddle from either Washington State all the way north, or from, sometimes it's held in Washington State, and they come from British Columbia and they paddle down in these boats. They get welcomed by the local chiefs as a big celebration. And it was just so joyful and wonderful to see how community was celebrated, to be in this Salish Sea, in this area that was for millennia had been used by native people, and they had traveled back and forth.
That's beautiful.
There's Native activism across the border. There's actually Richard here, was his daughter. So the water protectors. Native people protect your land. They're out there trying to protect all of us, all of Michigan. There's Line 5, I'm sure you heard of it. And there's spills all over, and this is a Canadian company who can skirt around things because of that. And they're running Line 5 across Mackinac Strait, and if that line, that old line that's already has hairline cracks, breaks, the largest freshwater supplier in the world is threatened. So Native people are active in that. There is water walks, and this was one of the most impressive ways of going across the border. You see the lines around these lakes. Well, this was this woman, Josephine Mandamin. It's an Anishinaabe grandmother who took on a sacred walk. She traversed over 10,000 miles. We thought we were pretty cool driving 10,000 miles. She walked it. And she walked around each of the Great Lakes, and she was known as the water walker.
Carrying a copper bucket of water.
Yeah. Carrying a bucket of water. And then I want to finish with a map, of course, as a geographer. So we can think of Native people across the border in different ways. So this is a map. It's called Raising the Line. I did that with my students. It shows you Native people across the border, where they are. And I didn't put the borderline in there. So you can see they extend all over the place. There's no real border here. But you can also see, if you go back to the first one, in the United States, the confinement on reservations, you can really see it much more clearly than in Canada, where it's more dispersed. And then finally, Native culture goes beyond borders, language revitalization. And in that spirit of language revitalization, we have Patty finish with a song in the Anishinaabe language.
I received this drum from my friend Michomis, who's in the audience tonight. I'm going to sing this song. Okay. It's called Gagi K, and it means forever. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Gagi K, Mama waits on good day. Gagi K, Mama waits on good day. Dana Sagawian, Shka Kamikwen. Dana Sagawian, Mino Gichikamen. Jesus Minawa Manidu, Tagian Gidwa. Tepiki Jesus Anangoka, Zagian Gidwa.
And with that, we say, Chimikwich, thank you for listening to us. Sorry we went a little over. So much to tell. And we're opening up to questions.
If you have questions, just raise your hand, and then Patricia and Guntram, I'll have you repeat the question, so our listeners can hear it over there, okay?
So I'm a linguist, and the idea of unsettling like our language around talking about indigenous peoples, where would you suggest to start?
So the question comes from a linguist, and she's thinking about asking about unsettling the language, right? And where would you start kind of rejuvenating the language?
There's a website called ojibwa.net, and there's a scholar named Margaret Newton, who is a linguist, but I am really not an expert on that. And then there's also Rosetta Stone, which we just subscribe to. Was there anything you can add to that?
Sure. So the language revitalization it's a very challenging thing, and you as a linguist know probably more than we do. But I want to just say for the audience, maybe in response, that there's Rosetta Stone, so they just started that. That you can now learn Anishinaabe on Rosetta Stone, which is a wonderful way. But many of the tribes are starting their language revitalization with the little ones, and that's where you have to really start. Total immersion in kindergarten, so you get really native speakers. We're very fortunate. There's several native speakers in Wigwamikong and Manitoulin Island, because they were the ones that were kind of unceded, and they kept the language alive, and many of the language teachers in Anishinaabe are for that. But different tribes face different challenges. There's a few tribes whose language, they're too small. They just don't have enough elders. They have like 4 elders left who are native speakers. That's really challenging to keep that language alive. Some have actually opted to take a related language and hook onto another program like that.
Thank you very much for your really beautiful presentation and also your outstanding research, and for really shedding light on the border issues affecting the tribes. I was wondering if on one of your future sabbaticals you would consider to expanding your research to the southern border, where there are even much harsher and deeper issues affecting tribes along the border.
So the question was, would we extend our research to the southern border during another sabbatical? No. It's a short answer, but I give you a reason for it. I feel we could do the northern border because at least a big stretch of it, we had some cultural knowledge, and I had a cultural research partner, Patty, who knows some of the culture, and you need some of the cultural protocol to talk to native people. The southern border is also much more brutal. There is areas where some of the border policies are really designed. Why do we build the wall? We're not building the wall across the whole thing, but we're building it in ways that pushes people into the desert to die. And that, as sad as that sounded, is really was behind that policy. And so it's a much more difficult border to cross. I speak some Spanish, but not good enough to talk. There's a lot of really good research being done on that. There's a migrant project, a GIS project, where they document all the people who have perished and try to trace them and give them recognition. But the southern border is a very challenging one. Interesting enough, there is a connection between the northern and southern border, that they rotate border patrol people from the southern to the northern and back, because they don't want border patrol to stay in place too long, because then they get too knowledgeable, too friendly, and it's much more difficult to make things, so oftentimes they rotate them through. And actually many of the tribes are doing work where they teach, and Patty's poem mentioned that, where they actually have to teach border patrol people, well, this is a sacred bundle, you can't open it and go through it, and they have the right to keep that bundle. So they have to be taught. So many tribes are actually engaged in working with border patrol. The Mohawks are actually assisting border patrol, trying to enforce their border as well, up in Kahnawake, in north of New York State. But the southern border, sorry for the longer answer here, that would be too challenging. I leave that up to some younger people.
I wondered if you would comment on this habit we have of using waterways as national boundaries. It's a convenient line on a map, but it breaks up communities. The whole point is that water is life. You go to the river to settle because you have the resources there, the fish, the transportation, and the water. And you're going to be on both banks. That's normal. But then we draw this zigzag line down the middle. And then if you're swimming across or canoeing across or whatever, you don't know which side you're on. So part of it seems like it's easy and convenient, but part of it's totally crazy. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay. So this was a comment about borders, that we use rivers as borders, and that is really problematic, as the person was pointing out, because water is life. There's borders. I mean, rivers are connectors. People are connected usually on both sides. You have ferries. There's the same people on either side of the border. And it's difficult to, even though it might be convenient because you can see it, it's difficult to use that. And a comment on that. Well, it's not even easy in some places like the Rio Grande, because if the river moves, and rivers don't always stay in the same place, then the border moves. That gets complicated and makes problems. There is, of course, people have argued we should use watersheds. So the drainage basins of rivers to create territories that would be held together and demarcate things like that. That's very difficult. I mean, the sad fact is that the 200 states or so that we have, it's a couple like semi not recognized and all that, but about 200 independent countries in the world, close to it. And those have sovereignty over their territory. And they're the ones who make the rules. And there's no global government, and the World Affairs Council is trying to raise awareness about those issues. And for that reason, there's no way that any of those countries would give up their territory and come up with a better border. In fact, they're loath to go to even, well, they want to have a little bit more territory, as we see in Russia going into Ukraine, etc. So I agree with you. It's a problem to use rivers as borders, but I don't foresee many borders changing to a better way, because the only way borders change is by having warfare. And in fact, the whole international system, international law is based on the idea of the inviolability of territory, meaning if somebody invades you, you have the right, it justifies to go to war. So that's the idea of just war. So you're not going to see changes like that, unfortunately. Go ahead.
You're so used to on the Canadian-US border and how tribes span that border. It seems that that is a worldwide issue. When you look at borders in Africa, the Middle East, they were not drawn up by tribe, but by longitude, latitude, or mountain, or whatever. So it seems like it's a worldwide issue, not just US-Canadian. Comment on that?
So the question was, that our study of the US-Canada border seems to be not just the case here, that tribes were divided, but that it happens all over the world, that we have these latitude and longitude borders all over the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, etc. Yeah, African borders, the straight lines, that's clearly a sign of colonialism. They didn't know what was there, so I said, okay, let's just use that line on the map here, and this side is yours and this side is ours, between two colonial powers. This is how they drew the lines. That's why they're so straight and so neat. It's a worldwide problem. I agree completely. You can question all this stuff, but again, the problem is that they're there, and they seem to be ingrained to the point where you can't change them anymore. I mean, you have plenty of examples. The Sami are an indigenous group. It's divided between Norway and Sweden and Finland. They go across, it's in the north. The further north you go, the less of a real issue is, because there's nobody there just to stop it. I mean, even in Alaska, we were talking to some people and said, yeah, the border patrol is there, but we're out there in the woods. If we go on the other side of the border, they don't even know in some of these places. And there's nobody there, it's cold. But in most cases, it's a worldwide problem. Borders are trouble. But on the other hand, we do need some borders then we have to start questioning, what about private property borders, right? We have those borders too. Would you give up your land or your house? Open that border up. So it's a way we organize our lives, so it's difficult. Yes, one more question.
During COVID, there was the Rocky Boys Indian Reservation in Montana that shut its borders. And what ability do Indian reservations have to shut their borders off within Montana and say, this is, if you're an Indian, you can stay here, this is your tribe. If you're not, you can't come
I don't know the specific case, but Native nations in their on their reservations, legally they have the right to own that land and to draw the line and to close the border. But the federal government always finds one way or another to kind of intervene and say, no, this is, you're cutting off a specific road that goes through there, etc. They will try to stop it, but legally they have the right to do that. And in fact, some of here in Michigan, Bay Mills Indian community, they closed the roads through their reservation off in the 70s to protest against state of Michigan increasing the speed limit on the road that went through there. They said, okay, we're gonna just close it off. It's on our land. This is not your road. This is our land. And came a standoff, and then there was an agreement or something like that. But they do have the right. It's their land, generally, and it's a nation-to-nation agreement. But we also know that many of these nation-to-nation agreements, actually, I think every single one, has been broken. So,
Yeah, one more.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering when you mentioned about that generation, the 60s scoop, if anyone
Swoop.
had followed those children or people, and if, you know, what were the consequences of that? Were they trying to go back to find their origins, or did you encounter people like that?
Talk a little bit about this, or
I don't know very much, but I think now they're beginning to. It's a term that many people haven't heard, and it was a very real thing going on in the 60s on Indian reservations. I'm learning more about it, but I'm sure if people are assertive enough and doing their research, they can find the source of how that happened and find the children that were taken from these homes.
Did they keep adoption records?
Yeah.
Adoption?
There's actually organizations that are trying to help Native people who were adopted to find their roots. And there is actually several films that are dramatizing that. Broken Bird is one of them. And then Little Bird, right, is a series. Yeah, that's a series that also kind of raises awareness of this slowly, because this is another one of those things that only came out more recently, as Patty said. But there is organizations, NGOs who are having, there's a database that's being collected. So the map I showed you with the lines, those are from a database, and so they're asking people come forward, okay, can you give your information, and then we'll try to connect you and we'll try to figure out where people were put. The real sad thing was when they put them across into another country. I mean, they didn't have a passport, or they couldn't get across. So families were really torn apart. And then when you are adopted, sometimes the records were lost and you couldn't find them anymore. So some people are still searching, but it's an attempt made by researchers to bring people to their roots if they can.
Let's thank Guntram and Patricia for wonderful reading.
That's the border, that's the website. So here,
It's a website there.
so if that's where the research is being done.
Okay, border-rights.org. Okay. Thank you so much. What a fascinating evening. Appreciate it. We'll stay for a few minutes if somebody has a question
Yeah.
for them. World Affairs Council, we are going to talk about Russia and Ukraine next week, Thursday. It's a virtual, it's on Zoom. If you go to worldmichigan.org, you can find the link to it. We have Mikhail Zygar, who is a Russian journalist. He had to leave the country because of his reporting, but his book is about what this looked like from the Russian point of view, inside Russia itself. This was developing. It's called War and Punishment, his new book. And Joel Westfall from the Ford Museum is going to interview him on a live Zoom next Thursday at 7 o'clock, I believe it is. You can find it at worldmichigan.org. And KDL, they've got 14 things going in the system every day. So go to kdl.org for that. Thank you again, Patricia. Guntram, appreciate it.
Thank you.